Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, some of you may be aware that I've made some appearances on the History Channel, and one of the shows that I've been a part of is Unbelievable with Dan Aykroyd. And we did an episode that I featured in pretty prominently about old jobs that just kind of sucked, like jobs from the last several centuries, historical jobs that, well, you just wouldn't really want to have. Dirty jobs, nasty jobs, not fun things that often were dangerous to you. And this goes along with that. This is from Chat History, and it's horrible medieval jobs that meant certain death. I think this will be an interesting one to take a look at, and I will not only link to the original video so you can check out Chat History without my commentary, I'll also link you to a video that shows some of that episode that I'm referring to from the History Channel on their YouTube channel. Let's dive into this one.
Deadly medieval jobs. Like a low IQ fella who just ravaged a Viagra bottle, alchemy was simple, yet very hard. Simple in the fact that it had three main goals: turn metal into gold, discover a universal cure for all diseases, and achieve immortality. Simple on paper, but very hard in the reality that no one knew what they were doing. The vast majority of natural science at the time was still a mystery, and it was up to these alchemists to fill in the blanks. But on the path to reaching those improbable goals, many critical discoveries were made. Distillation allowed you to purify poopy brown water by boiling it and cooling the vapor to make less poopy brown water.
So one of the things that's fascinating to me about all this stuff is that think about all the things we have in our world today and how many of them had to have been discovered through, thousands and thousands of experiments and trial and error. I just think about like when I make fudge, right? This is a really weird example, but we have this fudge recipe that goes back at least to my great-great-grandmother in Kentucky and has been passed down. And it's really simple, but it has always fascinated me. Like at some point somebody figured out that you could boil a certain amount of sugar and milk together to make this substance that then you could add some peanut butter and a little bit of vanilla to, and then when it cooled off it would turn into this amazing delicious dessert. And it would have taken trial and error trying different things, and how many people died because they tried something that turned out to be very deadly for them. So alchemy is so much about the trial and error, and it was about things that people gave you at the time that we now know might be deadly, but also might have actually worked at the time, but it might have given you 5 other diseases.
Many plants can be mashed into festering wounds to make them feel less like you're about to die. And sprinkling some sulfur and charcoal over your non-suspicious pile of potassium nitrate could create something called black powder that may or may not be useful in some sort of gun-like device in the future. But every new discovery was the result of thousands of failures. Sure, alchemy would eventually shed away a lot of the primitive theoretical slag and refine itself into modern-day chemistry, but it took millennia of trial and error, and many died in the pursuit of eternal health and infinite wealth.
Yeah, and there's a common saying that's attributed to Thomas Edison, where he said that he found, he didn't, succeed in creating the first practical light bulb, because he didn't invent the light bulb. He just invented a way to make light bulbs cheap and practical and last. He said he didn't invent the light bulb. He found 1,000 ways not to make one first, right? So you try all these different filaments until you find one that actually works in a vacuum in that situation. And he was building on the work of many others who came before him who did many things, including invent the first kind of primitive, not really usable light bulbs.
The extent of the alchemical process boiled down to purification, isolating crude elements into their purest forms. And how do you purify things?
Heat.
Fire. Just heat stuff up until something happens.
And that's how we get steel, and that's how we got iron. And it was just about purifying. You have to raise it to a high enough temperature to melt stuff, to remove the bad stuff and get the good.
The main problem. You see, alchemists had a rudimentary approach to their own safety when it came to faffing about with toxic substances. Their main form of protection was wearing long robes, or at the bare minimum, a durable leather apron. This would, at the very least, give +5 defense against any spontaneous splishes and splashes of any would-be lotions and potions. But if you've ever been chewed out by your chemistry professor professor, you know that's often the least of your worries. Now, getting a drop of salty water in your eye at school may seem trivial, but if that harmless sodium chloride enriched dihydrogen monoxide were instead something more spicy like, say, boiling hot mercury, and then things get a little bit more life-threatening-y. Alchemists didn't really use face or eye protection outside of just squinting a little bit and hoping for the best. But when that plugged beaker of boiling broth decides it wants to overcome a pressure differential, you're gonna wish that something was there between you and it. Now, if you were careful enough to uncork your cooking concoctions, you still had to deal with its byproducts. One of the most mysterious and thus often studied materials was liquid mercury. Since it looked like a metal yet flowed like a liquid, the element was often mistaken for the highly sought-after elixir of life itself, bringing many to an untimely end.
Yeah, it has a very different, like if you learned in school, obviously, that everything has a boiling point, everything has a freezing point, you know, where it turns from solid to liquid to vapor, and mercury just happens to have a very high temperature that it has to get, or a low temperature, I should say, that it has to get to in order to become a liquid. So it can sit in room temperature. It's not a solid like most metals are.
But that didn't stop alchemists from trying to unlock its potential secrets. In any case, the last place that you would want to be burning toxic metals is somewhere cramped and poorly ventilated. Well, it's a good thing that many of the alchemical labs in medieval times were cramped and poorly ventilated, filled with lots of flammable books and papers to boot. So when putting toxic elements to the flame, like mercury or arsenic, you're gonna form some nasty fumes. Historical texts allude to these dangers, stating that the vapors, quote, injured the spirit and body. Yeah. Trying to unlock the phenomenal cosmic powers in your itty-bitty living space is gonna mean trading breathable air for some that is deadly. The high concentration will almost certainly make your temporary life even more temporary. Your last feelings as you migrate to regions beyond will be that of you coughing up your burning lungs while your pounding brain feels like it's gonna burst out of your skull. Fun stuff. But even if you managed to dodge death in the short term, he was going to win the long game. Memory loss, hallucinations, or even paralysis are all possible side effects from long-term mercury and arsenic exposure. Sometimes, though, the most dangerous beast is ourselves. Unless directly employed by a higher power, alchemists often practice their craft in secret, not only to protect any possible discoveries, but to avoid accusations.
Right, there's a lot, you know, this is a very religious culture. And a lot of things that we know today were perfectly scientific in nature. When people didn't understand them, they could be viewed as magic and witchcraft and those sorts of things.
Many of the more feeble-minded people at the time mistook the scientific aspects of alchemy for witchcraft and sorcery with all that conjuring of flames and whatnot. So if the explosions, fires, or fumes didn't get you, Ned the nosy neighbor might.
You know, I'm just thinking big picture here. Think about what a time to be alive that we have now, where even 100 years ago, you know, I was reading about the building of things like the Brooklyn Bridge and you know, some of the most prominent landmarks that we have today, and more often than not, most of those large building projects involved numbers of people dying. And I read somewhere about one of the projects, I can't remember which one it was right now, but it was only 10 people died in building it, you know, and that was seen as a low number. You know, people for most of human history accepted that child mortality was a pretty regular thing. If you had 10 kids, there was a good chance several of them were going to die before they reached even 5 years old. And dying because of your job was a pretty common thing. A lot of people died from a lot of different jobs. Royal Beast Keeper.
You can already see how this one's gonna go. Listen, royalty has always been a world of extravagance and bragging rights. Get conquered, and you can bet that all of your treats and treasures were on full display to boast to other royals.
Look how big my shiny rod is.
Aye, take a gander at me family jewels.
Very nice.
But not all wealth was silver and gold, as King Henry III of England would soon come to realize in 1235. Arriving on the front doorstep one morning was a gift. 3 gifts, actually. As a present in good faith to maintain political relationships, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire dumped 3 adult lions on Henry's doorstep. Bah. King Henry absolutely adored the giant cats and set them up in a less than suitable habitat within the Tower of London, opening up the royal menagerie to royal guests as a royal flex.
Yeah, I mean, this is again, we live in a time where even if you've never seen a lion in person, you've probably seen pictures, you've seen videos of them. That wasn't true for people in England. They weren't traveling to Africa to see lions. It was very likely that they'd never seen a lion in their lives, and so this was a really major royal spectacle to be able to show something like this off. This was prestige. This was power and influence.
The menagerie eventually expanded, with elephants, a polar bear, non-polar bears, and several monkeys all taking residence within the walls. Now, each and every one of these exotic animals required special care, so in order to provide said care, specially trained animal experts were hired to do the job, right? No. It was, of course, cheap, uneducated, and expendable laborers that were the prime candidates. Poor, unfortunate souls sent to clean, feed, and care for the beasts. And it was all easier said than done. No matter how friend-shaped wild animals may seem, they're still wild animals, and they will murder you at a moment's notice. Once you stepped into the literal lion's den, you were at their mercy. Without extensive knowledge on how to meet their most basic needs, these animals were often feral and malnourished, and thus a very real threat. Especially when...
I love the fact that the animation involves actually just dragging the image of the lion around.
You're looking like a tasty treat. Habitats at the time, if you could even really call them that, were often poorly constructed and weren't any more complex than a simple cage.
And of course today we would say, oh, that's cruel to the animal to do that, but back then they didn't care about stuff like that.
Some historical records allude to incidents of collapsing cages or animals managing to break free from their chains and ripping apart caretakers limb from limb. It wasn't uncommon to catch a claw from time to time or witness your buddy get converted into a PNG under an elephant's tree trunk of a foot. If you did manage to survive the animals unscathed, you might not survive your employer. Like I said before, the animals were royal property, so failing to keep them healthy may as well be a slap in the face of the king himself. Any keepers responsible for a premature death of an animal were in for severe punishment. The lucky ones were simply fired. The less than lucky ones were also fired.
I'm not aware of too many people being burned at the stake for failing to take care of an animal. More often than not, there would have been punishment involved, but I doubt it would have risen to that level. Typically, the only people, at least the only men that were burned at the stake, were typically because of heresy, religious heresy. Often women could be, that was kind of the default punishment for women for treason. So, for example, Anne Boleyn, when she was convicted of treason, when she was Queen of England, and the treason took the form of imagining the king's death and having affairs, including with her own brother, none of which was true. She was initially sentenced to be burned at the stake, and then the king could commute the punishment to a simple beheading. A man in that same scenario would be hanged, drawn, and quartered.
The profession of plague rat catcher is pretty self-explanatory. Bunch of plague-infested rats carrying plague-infested fleas running amok needed to be dealt with. Humanely, of course. Although rat catching or vermin extermination itself has been a profession for as long as rats have been around, they were especially in high demand during the time of the Black Plague. European cities like Paris or London were chock full of the little beasts. The spreading of the disease wasn't exactly well understood at the time,
right.
And instead of placing the blame on microscopic corn dogs, the usual go-to scapegoats were the devil, poisonous air, or the classic Jews. But some pattern-recognizing fellows realized that filthy rats usually carry filthy diseases. And it was true. Black rats, as they're known, very much did carry debilitating diseases.
Yeah, for the most part, again, we're talking about a time when things like microbiology aren't really a thing. That's much more recent, I think, than most of us realize. If you have seen the Netflix series on the assassination of James Garfield, Death by Lightning, you see that even then you've got arguments going on between doctors about whether or not infection is spread because of using dirty instruments. Now, by that point, Joseph Lister's theories on that were starting to be widely accepted, and many doctors did understand you needed to sterilize your instruments, but not everyone did. So certainly in the medieval period, people didn't fully understand how this stuff was happening.
You got your leptospirosis to ruin your day. Muscles always aching, fever never breaking, your liver dies, stinging red eyes, and a rash that never goes away. You also had salmonella, which causes you to frequently force out fluids from front to back, but also makes you solid in your daily crosswords. When you don't want a mass infestation to evolve into a mass infection, rat catchers were hired to help minimize the spread as best they could. Rat catchers would hunt, trap, and kill the vermin, but in doing so, they put themselves at severe risk.
Yeah.
The thing is, rats don't exactly like being caught, so they're gonna go into a full-fledged survival panic.
All right, so time for a little VTH lore here that doesn't really have anything to do with this, but I have to tell you this story. All right, settle in, folks. So, once upon a time, I lived in Pennsylvania. Lived on a street that was surrounded by farms. And so, in our backyard, there was an electric fence that bordered between our backyard and the farm. With all those farms around and all that farmland came rats. And we lived in an older house, and frequently got rats in our house. And if you've dealt with mice are one thing, rats are a completely different thing. You have not fully lived until you're sitting in your living room and you see a rat run across your kitchen floor 15 feet away. It's horrifying. It's literally horrifying. So I figured out they were coming in through the basement, and so I started setting traps in the basement. And at first, I got a few of the rats, but they multiply pretty rapidly. And they're also fairly smart eventually when it comes to these things. And they stopped going near the snap traps. They wouldn't do it. I just couldn't get them in the traps anymore. But they always came into the house through the same area. And I didn't really have an easy way to block that area. So I set up some glue traps to trap them, because I knew they would have to cross that area to get into the rest of the house. So upstairs in bed, when one of the rats gets caught in a glue trap. Now, I don't know if you know this, but rats, they scream. They scream. And this rat started screaming. And this rat, it was horrible. It was worse than seeing a rat run across your kitchen floor. It was screaming. Now, I am not by nature the kind of guy that like kills animals and has no problem with that. When I would catch mice, I would actually put them in a trap that would catch them alive, and then I'd go release them somewhere. It's just kind of how I am. No judgment on anybody who doesn't do that. Rats were a different story, though, and so I still couldn't stomach what I had to do, though. So I scooped up the rat trap with a shovel, took it out on the deck, laid a trash bag over it because I couldn't look at it directly, and beat the rat to death with a shovel to get it to stop screaming. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
And gnawing at anything nearby, which would most likely be fingers, hands, an arm, or a face. The obvious problem with that is the contraction of the aforementioned diseases, as well as the Black Plague itself. Of course, there were many other hazards.
Right, so let's understand, though, that rat bites are not how Black Death was being spread. It was spread through the bites of the fleas that were on the rats.
Remember them fleas I mentioned? Well, they would do a little emigration to a new host.
Right.
You. Once you were infected, all of your own personal fleas and lice, since you're a dirt poor medieval peasant, would then further spread diseases like wildfire. But bites and bugs weren't the only threat. Rat catchers often had to venture into enemy territory, squeezing through holes and swimming through cesspits to find rat nests to kill them at the source. Rummaging around in all of that danky and stanky meant a lot of environmental exposure. Sustaining a simple scrape against a stone slab that's subsequently slathered in shit leads to a nasty, potentially life-threatening infection. Similar to the gong farmers or night soilmen from my previous Worst Jobs video, these rat catchers could also succumb to suffocating in sewer slop.
Yeah, so the night men who did what he's talking about there, that's one of the things we talked about on the History Channel episode.
Not only that, but the frequent use of arsenic-based rat poison could do a number on the lungs. The good news, though, is that all of the success of the medieval rat catchers helped severely limit the spread of the Black Plague, bringing the total death count to only tens of millions of people. You did your best, rat catchers, and it makes for a nice tale. Now, if you think that grave robbing wasn't a job, think again. Although highly illegal, grave robbers still performed work with the goal of getting paid based on whatever they could yoink from defenseless corpses. Compensation for work sounds like a job to me. And it was way more common than you'd think. According to archaeological studies by the University of Cambridge, it's estimated that over 20% of graves in northern and western medieval Europe showed evidence of tampering between the 5th and 6th centuries.
Yeah, and that's really early on. I mean, at that point, you're dealing with people who are robbing to try and get something of value out of it. I mean, it's crazy that this is a modern story. There was a story just the other day from Pennsylvania where they found that this guy had robbed like over 100 graves. And they found evidence of like more than 100, something like maybe 200 bodies in this guy's house, all from the same cemetery. But I'm sure he's going to get to later on, grave robbing was about the bodies. It was about body snatching.
Graves were robbed for two main reasons. The first and most obvious was stealing valuables. This could be anything from grandma's bracelets, rings, or even her iconic red jewel. If you were brave, you could even rip out Gam Gam's golden teeth. The other reason was stealing the bodies themselves.
But this is really less of a medieval thing and more of a like 17th and 18th or 17 and 1800s kind of thing.
Much more difficult, but potentially more lucrative. In the late medieval period, a medical revolution was underway, meaning that practicing physicians were in need of cadavers to poke and prod to figure out how humans worked. The fresh ones were preferred, but beggars couldn't be choosers. But they could be grave robbers. The dangers of the infamous side hustle were plentiful. For one, just digging 6 feet into the earth is not easy. If you've ever woken up to a few tons of gravel dumped into your driveway with your dad enthusiastically standing there with a shovel, you have an idea of how much it would suck. But besides the ergonomic injuries, digging that deep in fresh soil was very dangerous. By definition, loose soil isn't very stable, and there have been multiple reports throughout history of grave robbers being discovered buried in the very graves they attempted to rob. Robbers were also running the risk of digging up the diseased deceased. Victims of the plague, tuberculosis, leprosy, and smallpox can have their afflictions live on far after their own deaths. If life was like a box of chocolates, then death was simply a sack of farts. You knew exactly what you were getting, you just didn't know how bad. Cracking open a coffin could leave you coughing instead. But it was a known risk. If falling dirt and disease failed to cut your life short, then someone else would.
Right.
Grave robbing was a crime, a very serious crime.
Yeah, I mean, they call them ghouls, the people who do this, often grave robbing led to impatience over the lack of people who died on their own. And so then you would, help people along so you could get fresh bodies that way. Famous duo, Burke and Hare, up in Scotland, who did just that. But you can go, it's fascinating. And for those who are going on the Scotland tours that I'm doing this summer, and we do have 9 spots available for our second Scotland tour, which is in August of this year. And the link is in the description of all the videos to that tour if you want to check it out and see the itinerary, things like that. But I'm going to be leading a tour in Greyfriars Cemetery, the Greyfriars Churchyard, which is right near Edinburgh Castle. And you can see in that cemetery the towers that were built along the edge of the cemetery where guards would keep an eye on things to make sure grave robbers didn't come in. But more importantly, you get to see the mort safes, which were these metal cages that were built over graves so that people couldn't rob them.
Graveyards were holy property, and as such, any guards patrolling could act as your judge, jury, and executioner. Guards were granted special permission to deal with any disturbances any way they saw fit, like fitting a spear through your skull. Luckily, you've already done all the heavy lifting of digging a grave. The guards just had to tidy up. If the guards were more merciful, you would simply be arrested and your fate left to the courts. But you would most likely end up 6 feet over the ground before you ended up 6 feet under it.
This was a time, if we're talking about like the 1700s, there was capital punishment for all kinds of crimes. I mean, theft in general was not lightly dealt with. I was doing research on a relative of mine. This was a brother of like my 4th great grandfather. And this was in the early 1800s. And he was arrested for stealing a tablecloth. He stole a tablecloth and got 10 years in a prison hulk. Like one of those ships that they removed everything that makes it look like a ship, and it's just the hull of the ship. 10 years for stealing a tablecloth. They did not mess around.
Bell ringers actually had a pretty important job for the everyday person. They were the timekeepers. Yeah, sure, there was that big glowing ball in the sky to tell you dawn and dusk, but all the other hours were approximations. It was up to bell ringers to mark the important times of the day, call people to service, or chime special occasions.
Call peeps to praise Jesus. Again, one of those things we take for granted, just knowing what time it is. I can just, grab my phone and look at it, and I can see it's 11:55 right now. We take for granted little things like that were huge deals back in the day.
But doing so was extremely physically taxing. A standard tower bell could weigh anywhere between a few hundred pounds all the way up to several tons. Granted, the big-ass bells required multiple people, but each man pulled his own weight, and then some. Having a tug-of-war match with a several-ton hunk of metal isn't the best wager to make. The sheer momentum of these bells as they swung back and forth was something to be reckoned with, and it demanded respect. Or else. A survey conducted in 1990 asked several thousand London bell ringers about any injuries sustained during their ringing duties.
Wait, let's pause and look at some of this. 79 injuries to bell ringers. It's fascinating to me that this was something that was done as a survey, but I love it. Hit head into box, fell into bells, hung in tower, myocardial infarction, that's a heart attack, suicide, death. And the deaths were from the things we just read before. Tennis elbow, plantar tendon rupture, a slipped disc, scalping, rope burns, how does your tooth get extracted doing that? Degloved finger? Ooh, boy.
And the answers didn't leave much to the imagination. Ripped fingernails, crushed limbs, falls from the tower, and even accidental hangings had occurred. Ringing ropes became a death trap if the ringers became too complacent.
I wonder if they were really accidental or if they just got applied to a suicide situation.
Now keep in mind, this was in the 1990s, well into the modern age with considerations for safety. So imagine how much more frequent these types of injuries must have occurred back in medieval times. If you weren't snagged by the rope, you certainly had your bones rattled by the deafening sound of the bells themselves. Many of the large city towers were equipped with multiple bells, each one producing different pitches or rung under different circumstances. Being right in the middle of all that crippling cacophony.
So it says there that was Big Ben. So Big Ben is not, like when you look at the tower, you're not looking at Big Ben, you're looking at Elizabeth Tower. Big Ben is inside the tower.
Meant the risk of blowing out your eardrums. Each separate ring could emit a head-splitting 120 decibels, well into the deafening range of sound, even if only momentarily. For comparison, 120 decibels is like being right next to T-Swift's private jet as it takes off to cross the street. Each of those bursts of sounds were enough to cause permanent damage to hearing unless protection was used. And you know damn well medieval bell ringers didn't use no protection. They simply took the method of, you'll get used to it. The biggest threat to a ringer's life, however, wasn't the bells or the ropes, but something a bit more flashy. Lightning. You see, back in the God-fearing, superstitious times of old, thunderstorms were believed to be moments of divine rage. But don't worry, when God...
That's God from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I appreciate that reference.
God's mad, you can just soothe them with the sweet clang of tuned metal. Or, at least, that was the belief. Many medieval fellas instructed the poor ring-a-dingers to bang their bells in an attempt to chase away thunderstorms. And wouldn't you know it, didn't work. Some reports from the 1700s claim that over 100 bell ringers gained first-hand experience of the human body's ability to conduct electricity.
Wow.
Lightning could either strike the tower or the bell directly, delivering a death jolt down the rain-soaked line and through the poor soul attempting to single-handedly banish an entire fucking thunderstorm with a series of Taco Bell bongs. The number of deaths got so bad that some countries, like France, surrendered to the heavens and banned thunderstorm bell ringing until the invention of the lightning rod in the mid-1700s. Although it seemed like a relatively safe and simple job, working high in the tower had plenty of ways to get dinged in your dong.
Scribe?
Alright, hear me out. The medieval scribe was by no means an adrenaline-charged, fast-paced profession, but that's kind of the point. The life of a medieval scribe was the most bland, boring, and mind-numbing jobs in all of human history.
And yet ridiculously important because, we didn't, before the printing press, everything was copied by hand and you had to make sure you got it right. One little mistake leads to the next copy and the next copy and the next copy being wrong.
Before Papa Gutenberg invented his famous printing press, entire books were written by hand. This process was physically exhausting, mentally taxing, and extremely slow, resulting in books being expensive, which is why books were for rich people. But the requirement for a personal touch did allow for creative freedom, creating unique works of art with each copy. Sweet. But there's only so many times you can generate artistic flourishes around the word "the" before your creative juices start drying up. As a medieval scribe, your job was to write. All day, every day. Except Sundays. Those are for Jesus. But all of that writing, especially in the same position day in and day out, puts a very real toll on the human body. We simply weren't designed to sit for most hours of the day. So stop slouching. Scribes worked in specialized rooms called scriptoriums, which held all of the cutting-edge equipment needed for efficient scribbling: a writing desk, ink, paper, and feathers for quills. As for content, scribes copied a wide variety of topics: science, history, cultural literature, and of course, religious texts.
Yep.
This ensured that tradition and know-how could be passed down across the generations, binding knowledge in paper and leather. But them's a lot of words to read and write. Scanning hundreds of thousands of words with your eyeballs took a toll on them. The constant nearsighted strain often resulted in scribes fucking up their vision and developing chronic migraines. Now, there's often a misconception that, hell, even I had prior to researching this, that scribes were these frail old men writing by candlelight. That's not true. Instead, scriptoriums were specifically designed to take advantage of natural light, with windows facing the east to bathe in the morning sun.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even in, if you look at TV shows that accurately depict the period, you'll see that often when somebody's reading, they'll walk over to the window and hold it up to the light. Heck, I'm 48 years old and I have to do that now when I'm reading small print. I need a lot of light, so I'll often go over to the window or I'll go stand right under the light in order to be able to read it.
Desks were set up near these windows to maximize their illumination. The setting of the sun simply meant that your shift was over. Now, what people might not realize is that back in the day, candles were very expensive, and so was paper, so it would be stupid to literally burn through your money in a dimly lit room full of flammable paper. But yeah, like I said, all of that repetitive writing posed very real ergonomic hazards. The constant swishing of a quill across pages put a lot of wear and tear on joints and muscles, resulting in agonizing carpal tunnel syndrome and severe spinal deformations from all of the hunching over.
So all of this is to say that it was rough on your body. I don't know if I'd call it certain death, though, but I realize that I often get caught up in the title of a video rather than the content of the video, so we'll just continue on.
But if osteoarthritis or chronic back pain weren't enough for you, other inherent dangers were waiting. Another health hazard for these scribbling scribes was the very medium used to immortalize history: the ink. Standard black ink was made from plant-based fluid and iron sulfate. Black was the most common color, thus it made up a vast majority of the writing, and luckily it wasn't too terribly toxic. But all the fancier colors used to decorate or illuminate the pages certainly were. Vermilion red ink contained mercury, vibrant yellows and greens used arsenic, and bright white ink used lead. Exposure or absorption through the skin was known to have caused chronic physical or mental symptoms like rashes, headaches, and memory loss. Which brings up one of the more dangerous aspects of the job. It was actually very common for scribes to leave little notes in their copies alluding to them losing their friggin' minds. A note at the end of an 8th century book says, "He who does not know how to write does not think that it is a labor. 3 fingers write, the whole body labors. Whoever has read this book, pray for me." Another scribe from the 11th century wrote a little note at the end of his writing endeavor. It says, "Thus let this composition be ended here. God help my hands." And finally, we come to one of the most...
Those are such fascinating glimpses into people that we otherwise might not know a lot about. And I wonder if when they were writing that, they had any idea how posterity would still be remembering them hundreds of years later.
Damning examples. It reads, "The shit sucks. This was a real problem. The constant mental anguish of doing nothing but writing for years caused some scribes to teeter on the edge of insanity, where a comfortable rope necklace could free them from their suffering. Metaphorically, of course. Scribes really were some of the most unsung heroes. Despite the mundane career path, they were a critical part of human history.
Yep.
They were the ones who preserved it, or at least their version of it. After all, writers had the right to write what they thought was right.
All right, as always, good stuff. I will add this to the playlist for all of my reactions that I have done to his channel. Check him out. He's getting really close to 1 million subscribers now. Would love to get him pushed over sooner rather than later. And if you are interested in going to Scotland with us in August, check out the link down in the description, as well as the link to the video from the History Channel, which I will also put up on the screen. And special thanks to our executive producer and producer patrons, whose name you will see here.